All right, everyone, we're going to start soon here. I'm just going to give a couple more people time to join, and then I'll go ahead and start with introductions. All right, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We are going to be talking about cultivating caring communities in schools, tools for dismantling the school to prison pipeline. Our participants for today are going to be Melissa Goman and Joran Biggs, both from NJJN, and Katrina Goodjoint from the Galt Center. School-based arrests have long made up a substantial number of cases in the juvenile legal system, and this is particularly true for Black, Native, Indigenous, and Latino students, immigrant students, students with disabilities, LGBTQ+ students, and other historically marginalized students. Despite significant decreases in the rates of serious crime and violence on school campuses over the past 20 years, 67% of high school students, 45% of middle school students, and 19% of elementary schools attend a school with a police officer. Today, we're going to talk about why that's an issue, and I want to start just by reading some of the wonderful work that our panelists has done. Melissa Goman has worked throughout her career to positively impact children's lives and protect their civil rights. She is currently the Senior Policy Counsel for the National Juvenile Justice Network. Melissa previously worked as a legislative director for the ACLU of Maryland, where she was responsible for advancing a broad range of civil liberties issues, including work on criminal and youth legal system reform. Prior to the ACLU, Melissa was an adjunct assistant professor of law and the founder and director of the Juvenile Law and Policy Clinic at the University of Richmond School of Law, as well as serving as the president and co-director of the Mid-Atlantic Juvenile Defender Center and co-director of the Virginia Juvenile Justice Coalition. Together, these organizations advocated for reforming the youth legal system in Virginia and the Mid-Atlantic region. She received her BA from the University of Illinois and a JD from the NYU School of Law. She's also a member of the District of Columbia Bar. Our next panelist, Joran Biggs, is a senior African American Studies and Political Science student at UNC Chapel Hill. He currently serves as a youth policy consultant to the National Juvenile Justice Network. In this position, he has produced research on a state-level discipline policy, conducted focus groups with young people across the country, and aided the team crafting the organization's annual policy platform. Post-graduation, he plans on attending law school. Katrina is the Youth Policy Counsel at the Galt Center, where she works to interweave racial justice throughout the organization's programming work and partners with youth defenders and stakeholders across the country to enhance youth defense. Prior to joining the Galt Center, Katrina was a staff attorney at Juvenile Law Center, where she focused on addressing economic injustice and inequity for systems-involved youth and opposing extreme sanctions for youth in the adult criminal system through litigation, amicus work, and policy advocacy efforts. Katrina holds a BA in political science from Seattle University and a JD from Georgetown Law. She's also a member of the District of Columbia Bar. So thank you again, especially to our wonderful panelists that are here today. I do want to start briefly just by talking a little bit about why we're all here. And so if you could each just kind of take a minute to speak about the work that you do and why this issue is important, and then we'll go into topics. So I'll go first just to kick things off. I'm the current Galt Fellow at the Galt Center. I previously worked in youth defense at both the Colorado State Public Defender's Office and the Colorado Juvenile Defender's Office. My lived experience includes entering the school to prison pipeline at 13 years old for fighting at school. I went on to have many more experiences with law enforcement and many more suspensions, and I eventually went to law school and took an interest in advocating on behalf of youth, which included not only defense work, but speaking on various panels and in front of the legislator in favor of removing SROs from Denver Public Schools, which is actually where I attended and entered the school to prison pipeline. So This issue is important because my story is the exception and not the rule. And I will, I guess, popcorn it to Katrina.
Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you to my co-panelists here. Thank you for sharing that and for the great work that you do. So the Galt Center, one of the main things that we really focus on is ensuring that young people have access to quality representation. And one of the things that we're seeing from a lot of defenders around the country is letting us know that a lot of their clients and the young people they're working with are entering the juvenile legal system from school-based offenses. So similar to your experience here, it's a growing problem, especially having school resource officers, having police in school creates this direct lineage from school to prison. And I will say more about that later, but I'll pass it to Joran.
Hi everyone. I'm really excited to be with y'all today. Like Katrina and Tierra were saying, it's really important to acknowledge how the school to prison pipeline is sort of fostered by these acts of disobedience that seem menial but are criminalized as adults. And I think my personal lived experience with the school to prison pipeline isn't direct, but indirect in the sense that my father is a principal in the school district where I'm from, and my mother was the general counsel for the sheriff's office in the county that I'm from. And the schools in our school district contracted our SROs through the sheriff's office. So I feel like I got a really unique perspective in that I sort of existed at the intersection of my dad on one end representing the school system's interests and my mom representing the interests of law enforcement, and being able to find my own perspective on the school to prison pipeline through hearing about both of their experiences. And I'm excited to talk to you all a little bit more about the work I've been able to do with NJJN. And I'll pass it to Melissa.
Thanks, Joran, and good afternoon, everybody. I work with the National Juvenile Justice Network, and we've been looking into the problems with police in schools for some time, both from hearing from our members and youth members and youth we work with. We did focus groups this past summer that Joran will tell you about later, and it's clear that having police in schools leads to a great deal of stress for children. I also come from a family of educators. My dad was a principal, my mom was a teacher, and they taught me the importance of providing children with love and compassion, kind of the antithesis of what you see when police are in school surveilling children. I've worked on this issue also through my county, Montgomery County, Maryland, and a couple of years ago, we tried to get police out of schools and heard from just many, many young people testifying at the hearings about the stress that police were causing them. So if you look at the research, police do not provide more safety for students. In fact, sadly, the number of deaths go up when there are police in schools. So this is an issue we're really invested in. I'm excited to join the conversation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm interested, Katrina, could you start by just talking a little bit more about what you've been working on specifically in your role at the Galt Center as it relates to schools and prison?
Sure, and so for this, I will be sharing my screen. Let me know how this appears for you.
Good.
Perfect. All right, so before I get started, I actually wanted to do a quick poll because there's so many of us here in this room. Just want to get a sense of who's all here. So you should see on your screen just a really quick questionnaire. How are you, what role are you joining us as today? And this, you can actually check off multiple options. So maybe you're a parent, caregiver, and a student, and an attorney, just trying to see who's all in the room today. Okay, well, lots of social workers, welcome. Some attorneys, few law enforcement, advocates, parents. And if you put other, if you could just quickly in the chat, let us know. See if I can see the chats. All right, so many different, oh, okay, great. Nonprofits, school counselors, psychologists. Thank you all and welcome. So I'll go ahead and get started. So one of the main things I've been working on is this year for the Brown v. Board anniversary decision in May, we will be releasing sorry, you can see all of that. We will be releasing a publication called Defending Students Who Have Been Stopped, Searched, and Interrogated in the School Setting. And one of the things I want to do today is just really quickly go over some of the main points from there, but of course, feel free to read the publication when it comes out. There'll be so many more details in there, but I'm just going to give you an overview of stops, searches, and interrogations in the school setting. So first thing that we talk about in this publication, and it's really important to understand, is the history of how police got in our schools. So, you know, a lot of people think maybe this dates back to Columbine in 1999, but actually, and Chris Henning's book can provide so much more information. The first presence of law enforcement in public schools was as early as 1939 in Indianapolis. So this was an effort that was backed by the Ku Klux Klan, and this initial group of police officers was responsible for patrolling school property, conducting security searches after hours, and they later reorganized and changed their name to the Indianapolis School Police in 1970. So really direct lineage to white supremacist roots when we're thinking about how police got in our schools. And then after that, law enforcement presence continued to increase in public schools in response to desegregation efforts and the civil rights movement. So following the Brown v. Board of Education decision, which I mentioned earlier, many school districts, as we all know, refused to integrate schools. And this first picture that I have here in the top left is a student-led protest in Philadelphia in 1967, where students walked out of school in a demonstration. They were demanding Black history courses, more Black educators, and the freedom to express themselves and their culture. They were met with 100 police officers in riot gear, full riot gear, and hundreds of students were beaten. 57 students were arrested. So, you know, following the direct white supremacist roots, here we are now, police being used as a means to fight back against social movements. And following that, this picture here in the top right, so the Little Rock Nine, a group of 9 Black students who were attempting to integrate the Little Rock, Arkansas High School in 1957. The governor of Arkansas at the time ordered the National Guard to block these students from entering the high school. So again, we see police being used as a way to fight back against social movements and oppress social movements and student voice. Then in 1990, there was a super predator myth, the idea that sought to really dehumanize and demonize Black children. And as a result of this, Congress passed the 1994 crime bill, which substantially increased federal funding to police in schools. So further expanding police presence in school. And we haven't even gotten to kind of one of the main things folks see as the initial reason for police in schools. So Columbine in April of 1999 at the time was the deadliest mass shooting in history. And even though this incident took place in a predominantly white neighborhood, predominantly white school, what we see now are schools that are predominantly Black, predominantly Latino, Latinx, high population of Native and Indigenous students are being the most impacted by police and have the highest percentage of police in those schools. So here are just a few important concepts that are going to be woven throughout the 3 kind of areas of law that I'm talking about with you all today. So searches, seizures, and interrogations. So these are 3 very important concepts that come up often when we think about young people and their rights in schools. So first, the US Supreme Court has said that the 4th Amendment protections against unreasonable searches and seizures apply to public schools. So the quote in the case was, students do not shed their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gates. So even in schools, young people have rights. The second, and I'll go into more detail about these 3 as we continue our conversation. The third is, or excuse me, the second is a child's age affects how a reasonable person, and this reasonable person idea is a notion that we see a lot in the legal area. And in that, it says the child's age affects how a reasonable person in this position would perceive their freedom to leave. So essentially, the US Supreme Court in JDB created a reasonable child standard. And the question is whether a reasonable child, however one defines that, would feel free to leave the situation with the police, leave the interaction with police, or would they feel pressured to submit to the questioning, submit to the search, whatever the interaction may be. And Evelyn was another case in Massachusetts that also similarly upheld the importance of age. And a third concept that's very important to think about is race. So a lot of times, you know, maybe law enforcement, police may say that they had reasonable suspicion to stop someone because the person fled, right, ran away from them. And we have these two cases, state cases, but very important, that say running from police does not mean that, does not mean a guilty conscience. And the Warren case, which was in Massachusetts, the court looked at data showing that Black males were repeatedly targeted by police in Boston. And they wrote that, you know, fleeing from police suggests that, you know, maybe Black males want to avoid the indignity of being racially profiled. It doesn't mean that they're trying to hide something or guilty of anything. And the Miles case in DC went a step further and said that fear of police brutality and also just the proliferation of police shootings of Black individuals in this country could suggest that flight from police doesn't mean consciousness of guilt. Could be, you know, fear and a number of different reasons. So with these three concepts as our backdrop, we want to think about, so seizures and stops, kind of, you know, interchangeable in terms of the language that folks are using, but the court has defined two different types of seizures. So the first is an investigative stop. So these are typically brief encounters. They only require typically reasonable suspicion that the individual is engaged in some sort of criminal activity. So in that case, there is reason to stop them and ask questions. And when that exceeds a brief encounter, anything exceeding that stop in scope, in terms of, you know, duration, how long does the stop last, or restrictiveness, you know, unable to leave the interaction, maybe it's a tighter corner, maybe there's tighter room, excuse me, handcuffs, that becomes an arrest. And at that point, more protections are afforded to that young person. So another thing that's really important when we think about who is doing, when we're talking about the seizures or the search, who is doing that seizure? Who is doing that search? So I'm going to talk specifically about in the search context some of those different requirements. So looking at this slide, you can see the police officers acting alone typically need probable cause to search a young person or their belongings. School officials acting alone have a lower standard, and the courts have said because there's, you know, a lower expectation of privacy for students in the school setting, then school officials have a little bit more discretion to be able to do some of those things, doing, you know, searches or seizures, and typically school resource officers acting alone only need reasonable suspicion. That's typically, but of course there are different case law, and our publication I'm really excited about. It has a number of different cases around that show examples of when school resource officers have a higher standard, are being held to the same standard as police. So another thing to think about is school officials, if they're acting in concert with a law enforcement officer, or maybe they're acting at the request of a law enforcement officer, then there could be different standards required. It could be reasonable suspicion if the law enforcement officer's involvement is a lot more minimal, versus probable cause when the individual being searched is not a student, or if the officer is not acting under the school's discretion. So I want to ask you all you could take it a few minutes, maybe a few seconds, just look at this picture. And I want you, oh, excuse me, 1 second, let me turn off. Oop. My apologies. All right. You should be seeing the screen again. All right, so look at this picture. And then I want to do just a quick poll. So think about whether this young person here is in custody or not in custody. And so this is, up to you. I'm not giving you an answer, but I want you to think about whether you think this young person is in custody or not in custody, and then why. So just type in, a few sentences about some of the things you observe when you look at this picture that make you think that maybe they're in custody or not in custody. And you should have a quick poll that showed up on your screen, or you could type a short answer. Okay, I see some of you are able to do that. And I'll just give you all a few more seconds. And then we can share some of the results that folks are seeing. See, people are still typing. I'm going to have to turn off the poll, though. I thank you all for participating. And you can put your answers in the chat. So I want to share some of the results with you all. And maybe you're not able to see that. So I'll just read out a few of them. So some of you mentioned how there's one student and there's 2 adults. So how would that interpret whether this young person feels they're free to leave? Some say not in custody, but maybe the youth would think otherwise. A number of you are saying the child probably feels like they're unable to leave. Someone noted that the adult is standing between, there's at least one adult standing between the student and the door. So that shows that they're detained. No law enforcement is present is what someone noted. Not in custody. So definitely a lot of different answers out there. And the point of this exercise really is to show you that this analysis of searches, seizures, interrogations, super fact specific. It's very important to think about the specific individual, the individual child, what their experience was, and of course, going back to the important concepts I mentioned before, age and race are significant and will affect each young person differently. So the last kind of bulk kind of area of case law I want to talk about are interrogations in the school setting. So there's primarily 2 questions that we ask. So one, was the student in custody, which going back to our previous slide, kind of the exercise that we did, whether a reasonable child would feel free to leave and end the interaction. And this applies when we're thinking about as well searches and seizures. Would a reasonable child feel free to submit to the questioning or submit to the search? And then the second question, was the student interrogated? So did the police, if the police directly do the questioning, courts are more likely to say that was an interrogation. But let's say it wasn't the police, it's a school resource officer, it's teacher, some sort of principal, other school official. Are they engaging in non-questioning actions? And this is how the court defines it, that they knew or should have known would be reasonably likely to elicit some sort of criminal response from the young person. And so there's different factors we can think about when we try to understand, what does that mean? How do we, these are very broad concepts. So how do we know how to interpret how a young person might feel? So some of the things we want to look at, and you all, actually a few of you noted this too in the picture we looked at before, the number of adults present. How many of them are in uniform? And who are these adults in the room? Are they principal, superintendent? What type of role do they have in the school system? And the location of the interrogation. I think some of you actually mentioned as well in that poll, there are no windows. So, is the door closed? Is it a smaller room? Are there desks? Who's standing? Is the young person sitting and everyone else is standing? These are all important things to think about. And how long was the interaction? A couple minutes, half an hour, couple hours? The tone of voice, is anyone yelling, raising their voice? Presence of weapons, regardless of if the they're being used, if a young person sees them, how would they interpret their ability to leave, knowing that there's weapons in the room? And then thinking about school manuals and guides and policies generally, what are the guidelines for the school? Does it require that young people have to obey school officials and have to respond when they're asked questions? Because that really determines whether they feel free to leave a situation or whether they're, not allowed to leave at all. And then age and race, as I mentioned before, very, very important in thinking about how young people feel more coerced into responding to authority and submitting to authority. So I want to make sure that I give enough time for my co-presenters. So as I mentioned before, our publication will be coming out in May. Very excited about that. And we can drop a link in the chat for you all if you want to sign up for our listservs, and you will be notified when the publication comes out. So I will pass it on to Joran, but thank you all. And I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much, Katrina. I think everything you said is a really good segue into what I'm here to talk to you all about, which is my work I did with NJJN over the summer, particularly the work I did uh, facilitating focus groups with young people across the country and the information I gained from that, as well as sort of an assignment that guided how Melissa and I approached that, which was my research into Wyoming's discipline policies. So just as a bit of context, I've been working with NJJN since my senior year of high school, actually, and now I'm a senior in college. So about 5-ish years now. And I was initially introduced to them through the Youth Justice Project. It's an arm of the Southern Coalition for Social Justice here in North Carolina. And with NJJN, I've been able to work in a couple different capacities, helping them plan their annual forum, consulting on youth engagement. And this past summer, I worked as a youth policy intern, working pretty directly with Melissa to gather information for the publication of our policy platform. And the main way I did this was through the facilitation of these focus groups with young people across the country. And what we're really trying to do is ensure that our policy platforms included direct youth voices, and that we were making sure we had a good gauge of how young people viewed their school environments and their feelings on different policies and procedures that went on in their schools. So with that, before I go into the specifics of the focus groups themselves, I want to discuss a little bit about the work I did with the Wyoming research project. And with that, I was working with Donna Sheen and other advocates with the Wyoming Children's Law Center to help develop a fact sheet that analyzed different school discipline issues within the state. And initially, I thought Wyoming might be somewhat of an outlier in terms of school discipline policy, just because it's not a state that comes to mind immediately when you're thinking about people generally, and definitely not youth justice. But I think Wyoming was unique in that it provided a lot of information on school discipline culture generally in that area of the country. And within Wyoming, there were a lot of unique aspects of their school districts, particularly how they were cut up, even within a county. I know one of the counties I analyzed had 8 school districts within it just by itself. So I think looking at Wyoming provided a lot of information that could be applied to different areas of the country. So with that, I went through some Office of Civil Rights data, and I'll drop that link in the chat now so you all can um, follow along with me if you want to, and also so you can see civil rights data for your own school districts around you. And I'll share my screen and just go through a couple of highlights that I learned from this project. So, sort of a broad overview of school discipline policy in Wyoming. I tried to look at things that happened throughout the state that I thought were unique or particularly troubling. And one of the first things that jumped out to me was the list of suspendable actions that students could get put out of school for. So there was a lot of vaguity in a lot of these districts' descriptions of what a student could be suspended for. So we had things like profanity, but I think what troubled me the most was this issue right here of quote unquote behavior detrimental to morals. And just having a action be described so broadly allowed for that rule to be applied sort of at will of administrators. And then with that, there were no specified actions that I found that required law enforcement intervention. And I thought this was something that could be helpful, but again, it leaves the door open for over-policing due to this vagueness and this lack of clarity on when these rules should be applied. And then to round this out, I saw that suspensions and expulsions were capped at 1 year, and corporal punishment was still legally permitted in Wyoming. And like I said before, the discipline policies that I was analyzing here, they generally aligned with other states in that mountain region of the country. Particularly Montana and Idaho seem to have a lot of similarities with Wyoming in terms of their school discipline policy, whereas outlier I did see was Utah, who I mentioned at the bottom as a potential model for reform. So I want to take you all through just a couple of counties that I analyzed that I think might represent some of the starkest demographic gaps or inequities in school discipline policy. And I will reiterate this note that I had on my original form, and that the OCR data doesn't distinguish between white and non-white Hispanic or Latino students. And in that same vein, there isn't reports of the races of students who are identified as bi or multiracial. So with that, there is the possibility that some of these racial groups may be under or overcounted in this data just because they're not legally required to go into the specificity necessary to get as clear a picture as we could. So I wanted to start with Laramie County, which was the most populous region in the state that I looked at. And with that, white students made up 70% of the school district in Laramie County, but they accounted for none of the expulsions reported in 2020. So 66% of expelled students in Laramie County were Black, 33% of expelled students were Hispanic, and then Native American students are the demographic most likely to receive out-of-school suspensions, though they made up a portion of the demographic that was a little bit lower than Hispanic students. Similarly, we have 32% of the over 2,200 absences that were recorded in the county caused by out-of-school suspensions were days missed by Hispanic students. And then IDEA students, which are students with reported disabilities, they made up 13.3% of the student body in Laramie County, but they accounted for 29.4% of in-school suspensions and 25.8% of out-of-school suspensions. And with in-school suspensions in particular, there's a lot of vaguity in that some districts will commit the practice of sending a student to ISS or in-school suspension for multiple days in an effort to lower their out-of-school suspension rates. So with that, ISS frequently looks like students being placed in a single room of a school building for the entire school day. In theory, teachers are supposed to ensure they receive their work through some messenger. A lot of times teachers themselves will deliver packets of schoolwork to the students who are in ISS, but there are also numerous documented instances of students just being made to sit in a room all day, with that sort of adding to the school to prison pipeline in a way that isn't necessarily analyzed as heavily as out of school suspensions or expulsions because they're not reported in the same way. So we see with ISS, students are falling behind, students are being isolated from the rest of their classmates, leading to different social and educational impacts that aren't being looked at the same way as these more direct forms of being pushed out of school. And then another county I wanted to look at on this list was Natrona County, which was unique in that I found a lot of the IDEA student data that I used came from here. So 15% of all students with disabilities in Natrona County received at least one in-school suspension. And Black disabled students made up 1.7% of all disabled students in the district, but within that group, 32% had received an in-school suspension at least once. So we see these very serious disparities that happen at the intersection of race and disability. So these things compound to ensure that disabled students of color are being discriminated against at numerous aspects of their identity and are receiving this school environment that is particularly hostile towards them. Again, we see Black and Native American students with disabilities were the groups most represented in the breakdown of all expulsions among students with disabilities. And we again see Hispanic students overrepresented in every discipline category except expulsions, where they, along with white students, happen to be underrepresented. Here, we saw Black and Native American students make up 13% of all expulsions, despite the two groups together comprising only 2% of the total student population of Natrona County. Native American students had disproportionate rates of in-school and out-of-school suspensions, and Black students were overrepresented in every discipline policy. So I wanted to take you all through this information just so you can get a bit of context about the information that helped guide Melissa and I as we facilitated these different focus groups with youth across the country. So our focus groups were oriented around these four broad questions that we created with the idea of leaving room for the young people to broaden their own responses. So our first question was, what things, places, people come to mind when I asked them to tell me about their school? We then asked, what would an ideal school look like? And finally, we asked, when I say quote unquote school push out, what comes to mind? And this last question, school push out, was particularly fruitful in that NJJN had our own sort of internal definition of school push out that we would use amongst each other. But we wanted to present it to the young people without giving them our definition to sort of see what ideas they came up with on their own and use that to adjust our definition as follows. So we heard them talk about things like presence of police in schools, excuse me, and the absence of administrators during the school day. There were numerous young people who discussed not seeing a principal or an assistant principal at all unless they were in trouble. So there was no sort of community building within these schools, and the environment could at times feel super corporal in that you weren't addressing these um, grown people in your school unless it was an instance of you being expelled or suspended. So this hostility extended to other questions as well. I don't want to downplay the positive aspects of their school because there were numerous instances of students reporting positive interactions with people like counselors or teachers who felt especially supportive. But I do want to ensure that I'm being clear in my description of how the school to prison pipeline really infiltrates these schools and aids in the creation of this environment in which students are reporting not feeling safe, feeling like they know because of their skin color, their gender, their sexual orientation, that they'll be treated differently than other students. And I know Melissa will be digging more into the information we gathered from them in her presentation. So I'm good to kick it off to her.
Great. Thank you so much, Doran. Appreciate that. I'm going to try to share my screen now. There we go. As Doran said, we talked to a lot of students from all across the country in focus groups and sometimes individually in order to get an idea of what would make a transformative school and why are they needed. So from these discussions, as well as research that we did, we derived this central recommendation that you see here, which is that our nation's schools require really a transformational culture shift so that we can create an environment where all students feel honored and supported by teachers, staff, and school administration. And to do that, school systems really need to prioritize investing in inclusive, trauma-informed, culturally responsive schools that create a supportive and connected school climate and community. And you can't have that supportive community unless you also end the practices and policies that lead to the easy criminalization of children, as Doran pointed out, particularly Black, Brown, Indigenous, disabled, and LGBTQIA+ students. Okay. So our young people we talked to came up with a vision of transformative schools, discussing what they needed to thrive in their schools. So one thing was a healthy and positive learning environment. So that's a learning environment where teachers and administrators really listen to student concerns and try to address them and treat the students with fairness and respect by a diverse staff and teachers. They also wanted schools to take a trauma-informed approach, meaning that the teachers, staff, and administrators would really focus on getting to the roots of problems and behaviors and academic challenges and addressing them in ways directed to helping students succeed. And then students also wanted access to mental health staff and supports that they could reach out to for emotional support instead of school-based police officers, which are actually sometimes used as these emotional supports. So with these transformative school environments,
Melissa, are you
Mhm.
able to make the slides bigger? Like put it in presentation mode?
let's see,
I think at the
that's
bottom
a very
right.
good question.
Mhm.
Okay, the bottom. Let's see. Okay. Um, which works? Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not figuring
If
out
you
how to
hit
do that.
slideshow, maybe?
Is it slide control? But
No,
this is a-
slideshow at the top. So you're on home if you go to slideshow. Yep, and then scroll over to move your mouse over to slideshow.
see a slideshow.
It's
It's
okay. Yeah, I just wanted to see if you
Yeah,
were able to
sorry,
make
I'm
it
not
bigger for
seeing
folks.
it. This is the last one with small writing, so sorry about that. So students felt that we could help to end school pushout by prioritizing some of these things we have here, which is positive, happy school environments with a lot of school spirit, school participation without reliance on suspensions, expulsions, and arrests, engage in coursework. A lot of students spoke, especially Black and Hispanic students, about feeling that they were discouraged from taking more advanced classes and they wanted encouragement to do this. They wanted to see a proportionate number of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and other students of color enrolled. They wanted pipelines to higher education or vocational careers, but not pipelines to the youth legal system, and dispute resolution using mental health staff and restorative justice programs. So based on these discussions, we developed these 7 recommendations to reduce school pushout. Developing a positive school climate, collecting the data, assessing and serving children with disabilities, investing in caring adults, school counselors, and so forth, ending the punitive practices we discussed, treating all students fairly and equitably, and using restorative practices. And I think I have time to get into some of these a little bit. So in terms of developing a positive school climate, we recommended a multi-tiered system of support framework. It's something recommended by the US Department of Education, basically 3 tiers. So the first is universal strategies and supports. So this means strategies used with all children in the school. So this would be things like community schools is one example. And a great example of a community school is the Los Angeles County Office of Education, which started a pilot program. They put a community school in each one of their 15 school districts. And then they did a needs and assets mapping process, which was really helpful to determine, the exact resources needed for that particular school. And then they partnered with a number of county agencies and nonprofit organizations to provide services that included mental health services, wellness centers, enrollment support for social services, and even affordable internet access. So targeted strategies and supports refers to strategies for groups of children that might have additional needs. So these can be things like social skills instruction, self-management strategies, and restorative practices like group conferencing, restorative circles. And then intensive strategies and supports are really meeting the specific needs of individual children. And so that's where you get into things like mental health counseling, wraparound services if students need healthcare and housing assistance, and functional behavior assessments if you think a child might have a disability. So next, investing in caring adults, meaning, mental health staff. These can be school counselors, psychologists, and credible messengers. It's recommended schools have a minimum ratio of one school counselor and school psychologist per 250 students, but very few schools meet that ratio. We know that this is important for, many reasons. Students we talked to told us it was important. We know there's a mental health crisis with children right now. And from research, we know that there are many, many positive outcomes to having a school counselor. Things like increased attendance rates, increased graduation rates, and decreased expulsions and suspensions. So strategies for investing in more caring adults include things like school-based healthcare centers. They're sometimes called wellness centers. These are right in the school, and they can provide everything from physical care to mental health care. Increasing the school-based mental health staff, which we talked about, credible messengers in schools. So these are folks from the community, sometimes that have been system involved, that can really relate better to many children that might be in that community. And they've been used a lot so far in the juvenile justice system, but they really can be used quite effectively in schools as well, and are starting to be used in that way too. And then youth mobile health response services. So this would be kind of a crisis management that you could call instead of calling police if there is a student in crisis, and they can come directly to the school. Okay. So next is assessing and serving children with disabilities. Students with disabilities are often treated the most punitively. I think Joran brought out some of those statistics that they're more likely to be suspended, expelled, and disparities are the worst for Black students with disabilities and students of color in general with disabilities. So schools have to meet responsibilities under federal law. I think going through the details of that would be another webinar, but just briefly, if they think a child has a disability, they need to conduct a functional behavioral assessment. They might need to develop an individualized education plan for that student. What they should not be doing and need to stop doing is referring students to court for behaviors which are a manifestation of their disabilities. And when schools are not meeting these responsibilities, parents can file a complaint with the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights or the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Next slide. We recommend using restorative practices. So these are processes that proactively build healthy relationships and a sense of community to prevent and address conflict and wrongdoing. So it really should be done on both a school-wide basis and a targeted basis. So in terms of a school-wide basis, this is teaching all students social and emotional skill development. Can also be things like daily community building circles in the classroom. And then on a targeted basis, you can use restorative justice to handle conflicts that come up. It can also be done through peer mediation in a lot of different ways. And it's been found to really reduce the number of students suspended and expelled, and to really create a more positive school climate. That's great. Next, importance of treating all students fairly and equitably. I have some statistics there about Black girls being 5.5 times more likely, and Indigenous girls 3 times more likely to be suspended from school than white girls. So again, the reason that a transformational culture shift is needed. And this really involves schools intentionally engaging impacted parents and children to work together to identify solutions, and schools building relationships with families and caregivers to foster a sense of inclusion for all children. Bronxdale High School, New York is a great example of a school that is doing this effectively. Their vision, which they try to carry out, is to create a safe, caring, and collaborative community in which staff, students, and families have voice, agency, and responsibility. And the teachers really try to carry out this vision by emphasizing community building, by prioritizing developing trusting relationships with their students, and developing an environment for children of belonging and safety. Next slide. I think there we go. Okay, so collecting the data. It's hard to know the extent of a problem unless the school systems are really collecting and sharing publicly data on suspensions, expulsions, and arrests, and disaggregating them by as many factors as you can. And so a great example of this is Hawaii, where their law requires that the State Department of Education collect data annually and report it to the legislature, disaggregated by all these factors you see here, from race, ethnicity, to low-income status, looking at disability status, and students who are below grade level. And so they can get a really good picture of what's going on in the schools. Next slide. And then finally, which we've talked a lot about, is ending punitive practices. So of course, removing school-based police, but also these other elements, getting rid of zero tolerance policies. So these are policies that assign a very explicit punishment to a specific violation and are mandatory. And then exclusionary discipline, so severe punishments like expulsion and suspension. And I think Joran mentioned, some of these vague statutes that are extremely harmful. And you see them often in terms of things like I have here: ongoing open defiance, habitually disruptive behavior, disturbing schools. It's very easy then to take any behavior of a child and say that it fits within this category, and then it's much easier to provide this exclusionary discipline or even arrest for these behaviors. And students suspended or expelled are more likely than to be also arrested during that same month of their suspension or expulsion, because obviously they're often with no resources during the day. And so you really can see that pipeline from school push out to prison. So, and lastly, ending restraints and seclusion, which is still unfortunately practiced in many schools. Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. And I just want to say thank you one more time to each and every one of our panelists. You guys were amazing. We had a bunch of questions in the chat. And so I do want to go ahead and end today with just answering some questions while we have, I guess, 5 minutes. I'll go ahead and put the link to our listserv once more in the chat for those of you that want to be notified when we release our publication for the search and seizure later this year. But if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or you can use the question and answer function, and we'll answer those. So I have one question. Can you speak on true community building when implementing restorative practices?
So I think I was mentioning the Bronxdale High School in terms of, I think any practices, including restorative justice, used in a school system really need to have the input and engagement of the community. So I think that's really vital to making it successful. And it also, when you're talking about restorative practices, should really ideally involve the entire school staff. So not just the teachers, but the administrators and all elements of the school staff, so that there's really an understanding how to treat children, and everybody is, on the same page. And you can also bring in parents to these discussions as well, to learn what the school is doing and to provide their input. Uh,
This next question, can you speak on getting buy-in for the change in culture that we are asking for in the climate of school boards in 2023?
Like Jordan or Melissa, you all got that one.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to it just with my own experience with our school board here. I guess I do acknowledge how the political demographics of school boards across the country are shifting towards conservatism, and we're seeing like these numerous instances of critical race theory basically being put on a witch trial. Schools enacting these "Don't Say Gay" anti-African American study bills across the country. So I think with that in mind, buy-in is a little bit harder, just in that we're dealing with an audience who isn't necessarily interested in the truth, but in pushing an agenda a certain way. But sort of in that vein, I think what's been super successful when I was in high school and even outside of high school, being a college student and still tapped in with Durham Public Schools, has been direct student engagement. So I think we have numerous nonprofits across the city, particularly working on juvenile justice, who have been able to develop these youth advisory committees or other boards filled with young people who are public school students who can directly speak to their experiences and come to the school board, not necessarily approaching these circumstances rather from an abstract point of view, but rather this is what happens in my school and this is how I would like it to change. So I think in that same vein of community building, there has to be some outlet or some institution that allows for direct youth participation as opposed to speaking on behalf of young people when they are able to speak for themselves.
I think those are excellent points, Joran. And I would just say that, we have to engage in the school board elections. I think for a long time, folks were really not, it wasn't on their radar. But it really has become a battleground, and it's important to make this an area that people really pay attention to as much as all the other, races that go on during campaign season, and to really make sure that you're keyed into what's happening.
This question's more broad. Is there any specific data research about charter schools? So maybe trends to
I have not looked into charter schools, so
Okay.
I can't address that.
Yeah, excuse me, I can speak a little bit about that. So in our research into, searches, seizures, interrogations in the public school setting, we did look into charter schools, and there isn't a general consensus around the country of charter schools. They're this kind of quasi-public, quasi-private entity. And so, we're seeing a lot of different excuse me, standards for school resource officers and police. So, I think this is a great opportunity if folks want to put in the chat how charter schools, if you have an answer, how are charter schools seen? I see Cheryl says in her state, charter schools, public schools, so probably held to the same standards when we were talking about earlier of public schools and school officials in those settings, but be interested to see what other folks are seeing in their states.
Seems like charter schools are a little elusive, judging by the chat. But yeah, that brings us right on the hour. I do want to, Maryland as well, they're public. I want to say thank you again. I really, really enjoyed being able to be on this panel with you all and hear about all the great work that you're doing. We will be sure to follow up with everyone that attended today with the references and other publication materials that we referred to, as well as a link to the recording in case you want to share that or rewatch it or go back and look at it. And I just dropped a link to the listserv. So if you guys want to go ahead and sign up for that, so you'll be notified when the search and seizure brief comes out. But besides that, I'm so thankful that you all joined us today.
Thank you for moderating, Tiara.
No problem.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everyone.